So this happened at Christmas a couple of years ago when I was spending the holidays with my parents and little brother along with my cousins, aunts, and uncles. We live in a suburb in Ontario, but we were venturing out into the woods for Christmas, an idea that my parents had had for a while. They always loved the idea of being out in a hunting cabin during Christmas with their families. I'm a 22-year-old female now, but at the time, I just turned 18 and my little brother Tom was 11. We're really close and do everything together. We also had a dog, a German Shepherd called Trigger, who came along for the ride too. He's a real softie, but can be really overprotective, especially of my brother Tom. Anyway, we left from our house on Christmas Eve at around 2 p.m. and climbed into our dad's truck, filled with all of our stuff and presents for his extended family. Tom and I were really excited, winding each other up, and my parents were having friendly conversation as we moved along the road. We arrived at the village near the cabins we were staying in and caught up with my dad's sister, Billy, along with her husband and 3 kids. They didn't converse for long, but Billy was a bit unsure of where to go from the village to get to the cabins, so my dad helped her out by writing down the directions. We soon got back on our way and arrived at the cabins at around 4 p.m. There were a cluster of them sort of spaced out around the woods. Each family had a cabin to themselves, and there was one where everyone could meet up with a pool table, a swimming pool, and all sorts of activities. It was kind of a place we could all just chill together and enjoy each other's company. Anyway, the weather was already really cold when we arrived, and the snow was already falling around us, so me and my brother unpacked our things into the cabin and settled in for the night. My dad started a fire whilst my mom made our dinner. It was great. The Christmas decorations were already up and we played a few board games as the night got darker. Dad, Tom, and I decided before coming on the trip that we'd go hunting sometime, so we planned to go the next day. I've been a few times with my dad, but this was Tom's first time. He was only there to watch us though, as he was too young to shoot. It reached around 10 p.m. and my brother and I were getting a bit tired, so we decided to go to bed. My dad kept his rifles in a bag which he kept under the bed I was sleeping on. He'd usually keep it in a locked box, but thought there was no point since we were going hunting the next morning. Tom and I were sharing a room at the end of the cabin, facing a flowing river. The view was beautiful. Tom and I fell asleep with our dog, Trigger, laying at the bottom of Tom's bed. Now, this is when things began to get creepy. It was about 3 a.m. when I awoke to Trigger growling. I didn't find this particularly unusual because my dad suffers from insomnia, so sometimes when he can't sleep, he sits in our sitting room at home and watches some television. Like I said, Trigger is extremely overprotective and growls at any noise he hears, but that's when I noticed that there was no light coming from under my door. My dad never just sits in the dark. I whispered to Trigger, telling him to be quiet as Tom slept, but his growling soon turned to barking, which woke Tom up. He asked me what was going on, but I said Trigger must have heard some deer or something outside. After all, we were in the middle of the woods. Suddenly, our bedroom door swung open and the light switch was turned on. My eyes stung as I tried to focus on whoever it was at the door. It was my dad. "Were you two just laughing just now?" he asked as he turned to look at Tom, his eyes wide and his face pale. "No," I replied as he moved over towards our curtain, pulling it back as he looked into the pitch-black wilderness. "What are you looking at?" Tom asked as our dad closed the curtains again. "Nothing. Just go back to sleep." I was kind of creeped out that my dad didn't say anything about what he was doing, but he turned our light off and we tried to fall back asleep again. Of course, I couldn't. I was wide awake for the rest of the night, flinching at pretty much every noise. It was about 4:30 a.m. when I finally drifted off, but it must have been moments later I heard strange crunching noises coming from outside our window. I was sure this wasn't some sort of animal. It sounded like footsteps. I had this overwhelming feeling of fear and I pulled the covers over my face, sweat beginning to cover my forehead. I then heard a faint tapping on our window which lasted for a good few moments. I was so petrified I couldn't move. Trigger was awake by this point as I saw his face turn towards the window, his ears pointed and listening intently. The tapping started again, but louder this time, causing Trigger to bare his teeth. What happened next was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. "I know you're in there, little guy." This deep and husky voice whispered as a horrible shiver went down my spine. "Why don't you come out here and play with me?" Initially, I was filled with rage. I thought that it was bound to be one of my cousins playing a stupid prank on us, so I leaned forward and peeked through a gap in the curtain, ready to give them hell for scaring the shit out of us. But standing there wasn't any of our cousins. It was a creepy old man who was around 60, his hair matted and his clothes looked dirty and ancient. He was stroking the window with his hands, breathing on it as he spoke. I went into protective mode. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my dad's hunting rifle from under my bed and pulled the curtain back. "Get the hell out of here, I'll shoot!" I felt adrenaline rush through me as the creepy man's eyes widened and the most terrifying smile appeared across his face. Trigger began barking louder than I've ever heard him bark. My parents obviously heard the commotion and came running through to our room, turning the light on. My mum screamed as she saw the old man through the window, Trigger fiercely continuing to bark at the man. My father yelled at the man, telling him that the police were on their way, but the man legged it back into the woods. Tom was petrified, but I was angry more than anything else. How could some sicko do this? I was just extremely glad I had the rifle. The cops caught the guy just a few minutes later and arrested him. I found out a couple of days later that the creepy man was homeless and living in the woods, and he was suffering from a lot of mental issues. It scares me to death to think about what could have happened to my brother if I hadn't been there. We spent the remainder of Christmas Day at the cabin, but we stayed in our Aunt Billy's cabin overnight. There was no way we were sleeping on our own after what had happened. We went home first thing on Boxing Day and never looked back. My dad only told me the other day that he knew someone was hanging around our cabin, so he intentionally left the rifle under my bed in case I had to use it in self-defense. He did that because he didn't want to scare any of us. He called the cops after he heard the guy laughing outside of his bedroom window, singing nursery rhymes.